in turnaround, that would be the engaged business turnaround. Schindler's Attorneys, I'm the managing partner of Schindler's Attorneys. We'll be dealing with certain aspects of the law, and we'll also be speaking to practitioners as to the practicalities of the situation, specifically in relation to hospitality with a focus on restaurants. We're going to be looking at various aspects of business rescue, such as the labor implications, financing, and obviously the moratorium, which is really important when it comes to any claims in the current environment. So I'm going to kick off. I think it would be good just to get an overview on business rescue. We've had seminars, daily seminars, which go into the law in detail. We're not going to be doing that today. We're going to be dealing with the law in general. If you want to understand the law in detail, I'd invite you to go to the Schindler's Facebook page, where there is a webinar where we go through the various sections, the important sections in the Act, and we discuss those. I'd also ask that the audience pose questions specific to the situation that you and your team may find yourselves in. And if you want to have a debate in relation to anything that's said, I can put you up as a panelist, and it would be good. Bear in mind that the reason we have webinars is so that we can interact with the audience. Otherwise, it would be easy to pre-record and just play this over and over. So it's really, really important that you guys partake. Just if you wish, you can also ask the questions anonymously. You can raise your hands and you can write to all the panelists. We can also answer the questions individually. See here, somebody's saying the sound is very soft. I'm going to try and up the microphone. Where do I find it? If other people are also hearing, if it is soft, can you just raise your hands just to see if it's general?
I can hear you fine, Ruth.
Can you?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe it's just isolated.
I can also hear you fine.
Okay,
No,
great. Let's carry on. I see. David says he sorted it out. Thanks, David. Okay, so I'm gonna kick off by asking Peter from Engaged Business Turnaround to just take us through very briefly what business rescue is about and how it works. Then I'll get onto COBRA and how we intend doing things and how we intend to keep businesses out of rescue. But just to kick off with you, Peter. Thanks.
Maurice, thanks. Morning, everybody. Excuse me. Yeah, business rescue promulgated in 2011 in terms of the 2008 Companies Act, Chapter 6. Very much similar to Chapter 11 in the US and the rules of administration across Europe and in Australasia. Essentially what it does is it freezes all legal action against the company, i.e. puts a steel blanket over the company and protects you from any legal challenge. We talk about it drawing a line in the sand as at the date of rescue, which is a very simple process. It involves the directors of the company taking a resolution, appointing one of their members to sign an affidavit, or the entire board can sign affidavits, not a problem, but you need one affidavit. That together with the resolution, together with a form, gets filed at SIPC. And then it's all time limit driven from then on. You have to appoint a practitioner or practitioners. You can appoint joint practitioners. The practitioner then is obligated in terms of the Act with the same duties as a director, full fiduciary duties on behalf of the company, to act in good faith in the company's best interests. The practitioner then has to basically put a business plan together, which is called the business rescue plan, which lists the details of where the company's been, why it's in rescue, any legal claims against the company currently existing, and then how he or she is going to either trade the company out to pay everybody and at the end of it hand a healthy company back to the owners, or how he's going to wind the company down in order to make a better return for creditors than they would have got in the event of a liquidation. Not a high bar to better. The one thing that directors must be aware of, the practitioner is in control of the board. Certainly at Engaged, and Ian and I, we take a collaborative approach. So we will work with the directors and management. We take the view that the directors know far more about the business than we'll ever know. And it would be silly. However, you do have occasions, such as where there's been fraud, where one's got to take ultimate control over the company. The reason for going into rescue, it's laid out in Chapter 6 of the Companies Act, and it says, if a company is financially distressed, defined as you do not believe you're going to be able to pay all your debts as and when they fall due in the next 6 months, or within the next 6 months you believe the company is going to result in a insolvent position, that is, your liabilities exceed your assets fairly valued. In either of those scenarios, the board is obligated, to be honest, to put it into rescue. Just a warning shot for people, there is Section 22 of the Companies Act that covers reckless trading, and if directors do continue trading without going into rescue, then they are opening themselves up to challenge. There is a fairly daft section in the Act that says if the board decides not to go into rescue, then the directors have to advise all creditors that they are financially distressed and they've decided not to go into rescue. Now, if that is the end of the statement, then obviously you're going to have a queue of people at the door applying for your liquidation. And I'll leave Maurice to talk about how COBRA can assist in that scenario. Maurice, I think that is it. Important steel blanket around the company. Nobody can bring any whatsoever. That's not only recovering debt, that's any legal action against the company. Cannot do it. Creditors, any secured creditors, their security doesn't go away. It's just frozen. Any loans are frozen. Any amounts owed to creditors are frozen as at the date of rescue. And those loans or creditors or whoever you owe money to has to be paid in terms of the business rescue plan, which, as I say, is all driven by time limits. And once that's adopted, which requires a 75% of people who vote, either person or proxy, in favor of the plan, then you've got an adopted business rescue plan, and the practitioner is then obligated to implement that plan with some flexibility. Just a reminder to everybody, this is no different from business as usual. You're trying to run this business as it has always been run, but with the protection that your creditors can't challenge you, and you've got the injection of working capital in so much as you don't have to pay those people immediately, whereas in the normal course they would have had to have been paid under the normal terms and conditions of their supplier. I think that's it, Maurice, from an overall point of view. Maurice, I think you're
Maurice,
on
mute. Sorry.
You're muted, Maurice.
Great, sorry about that. What I was saying is, before we get into COBRA and how COBRA intends how it's come up with ideas as to how to save restaurants and how to keep businesses out of business rescue, I think it's important that we just have a general discussion in relation to where we are economically in the hospitality business, because what we've found is that there may be a need for certain reality checks, because the situation, according to economists, is as dire as it possibly can get. So there's no point in sugarcoating the situation that restaurants find themselves in for the purpose of today's discussion. There's also no purpose in debating whether the situation is as bad as it has been suggested. I just read an article today in Biz News by Howard Saunders, and he writes, in the short term, however, we must not underestimate the catastrophic effects it will have on the 21st century life. Thousands of shops, pubs, restaurants, bars, cinemas, galleries, and venues will close down for good. I also watched a video by Ray Dalio, who founded Bridgewater in 1975. It's a TED Talks, and I'd suggest to everyone to watch it. He basically deals with the fact that we can expect a whole new world order. I've read in several articles that globalization is basically dead, and lifestyles are going to change. So there's going to be a desperate need to reinvent oneself. And this is really what Ray Dalio goes on about. He says, the problem at the moment is that we're stuck in a particular paradigm, and that was the old order. And what one cannot do is try and apply the principles of that paradigm, or the principles of how it was, to the situation we find ourselves in today, and also the situation post the pandemic. He looks at the Great Depression. He makes the point that it took 3 years just for the situation to normalize, and the situation was very, very different. The causes were very different. It's conceivable that the situation today is worse. I see we have our economist who has joined, Safiso. I see you on mute, but if you can join us, just you want to comment on what I just said?
Morning, everyone. And thanks, Maurice.
Sorry, just to introduce Safiso, he's from the IQ Business Group. He's their chief economist. I don't know if you want to give a bit more around your CV, but he's an economist, and I think his views are key to today's discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Maurice. As introduced, I am the chief economist at IQ Business, and also look after the research team there. And I contribute regularly for Business Day, Fin24 and Sunday Times, and also contribute regularly on ENCA Newsroom and most of the radio stations, KF, Power, 702, etc. But I certainly think that the people in the room are probably much smarter than I might be. And it's quite an interesting, space to be in, and the point you make, Marisa, around, reinvention and the idea of new normal is quite an interesting one. One of the conversations, interestingly, yesterday on ENCA, the conversations was, what do businesses do right now, in the context of the fact that, it was specifically talking to alcohol and cigarette businesses, that, there's been this ban on the trade of alcohol and cigarettes. What do they do? And one of the ideas was, well, we've got to learn how to pivot. And if we just follow any of the global developments, we've seen how corporates, have utilized some of their productive capacity towards goods and services that are useful in the context of fighting the COVID-19 pandemic. And so how even some of the liquor brands locally have started producing hand sanitizers, primarily because, of course, they've got the primary ingredient, which is alcohol. And some of the thinking, we had this discussion actually with business leadership earlier in March when we were talking about the illicit trade environment in a South African context. And the estimations then, they were very conservative estimates that the economy at the time was losing about 100 million rand a day due to illicit trades. And this was looking specifically at alcohol, cigarettes, and textiles only. And you know, one of course, the thinking was that it was only going to get worse in the context of COVID-19. And so I think this is quite important for the thinking of people in this room, is that, well, if a lot of the businesses that are attributable or are related to the sale of alcohol and cigarettes, you know, just those two, for example, make up about 170 billion of our GDP. If you look at just fast food restaurants, I mean, 2018 numbers, they made top line revenue of about 568 billion. And that's just the fast food businesses. And so what it means is that, and those are also attributable to close to 300,000 direct and indirect jobs. And so I think the first thing is that it talks to the scale of the industry, and also more importantly, the extent to which the industry attracts labor intensity. And so then what does this mean in the context of the new normal? I think, you know, as I said, the first is around learning how to pivot and contextualizing your pivot strategies, not only to respond to COVID, but also to respond to the new ways of working. You know, I think South Africa, if you even look at our e-commerce, has been a relative laggard, even on the continent, even when compared to emerging markets as well as, of course, developed markets. But now, you know, we've seen a massive acceleration in the use of e-commerce. So the question is then, how do you contextualize what a new normal will look like for you in a more digitally intense future economy? So it's truly trying to understand the fact that the look and feel of the economy is not going to be the same. And so what does it mean for that business to remain relevant in the context of the economy? And you know, and that also then has particular implications for skills. So if currently your skill set or the skill set of the team that you manage does not inform the kind of skills that you will need to operate in this new normal, then you know, what are you thinking around now in being able to take advantage of some of the skills levies and skills opportunities that are in the economy that can you know, be tax deductible in one way or another, to ensure that you are able to retain the skills that you've got, or retain the staff that you've got, that you're able to upskill them and cross-skill them into this you know, nuanced economy that you're going to be operating in. I think that's, you know, certainly one of the key things that are going to be important right now. The second one, of course, is how do you, as a business, look at trends and work around planning around trends, you know? And so we've seen, for example, you know, the Uberization of economies, where platform has become the way of doing things, you know. So in the context of the businesses that you're in, we see that platforms are not going anywhere. They're here to stay. They're actually becoming a means of doing business. So how do you think about the context of your business in a platform environment? And I think that those are some of the ideas that will be important to ensure that you're both riding the winds of change, or riding with the winds of change, but also more importantly around what does it mean to build resilience within your business. And I think you know, one of the challenges I always say around the South African economy is a few things that we spent a lot of time forgetting how to do was building productive capacity. You know, so our import intensity in the economy has increased materially since 1996. And that's just the amount of things that you need to import to sustain domestic demand in the economy. And so, which means the true thing that we forgot to do was to build productive capacity, which would inform resilience. And also another challenge with the South African economy, which I think is certainly gonna play itself out a lot more aggressively in the context of COVID-19, is the extent to which we've got high industry concentration. So the measure that is usually used for industry concentration is what we call Herfindahl index, and it usually just talks about how many businesses make up 70% of the revenue in that industry. And South Africa has got actually one of the world's highest sector-specific Herfindahl indices in the world. And so what that means is that on the one end, that makes it increasingly difficult for small businesses to participate because they get nudged out by the big players. And the big players, of course, also tend to misbehave from time to time in terms of anti-competitive pricing behavior, particularly from a pricing point of view. And so also then what does it mean for businesses, small businesses, to know what's available to them through, for example, the Competition Act, that will enable them to remain competitive in an environment that is, I think, relatively unkind a lot of the times for small businesses. And so it's in businesses also understanding that we do have the Competition Tribunal, we do have the Competition Commission for some of those cases to get explored, to get looked at. And unfortunately, some of those cases don't get looked at if businesses don't complain. So the Competition Commission can't initiate a case that would need a complaint to come to them. And so I bring that up because, as I said, industry concentration in South Africa has been one of the restrictive elements, particularly for small businesses to be able to compete effectively. And so I think that as an introduction to the conversation around some of the challenges that you're facing, some of the economic context and overlays, will be, I guess, the point where I leave it as a start to the conversation. But there's certainly more, I think, context and more conversations we can have around what's happening in the economy, what are the structural constraints that are in existence, or what are the structural opportunities that also exist in the economy, and how ought we, or what should we be thinking about right now in order to position ourselves for growth and resilience in a current COVID as well as a post-COVID environment.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. That's pretty spot on. In the context of the pivoting and the fact that one needs to evolve with this massive paradigm shift, it begs the question as to what does one expect? And I see that a question has been posted by Pamela. What are we to prepare for? What business model innovations can we think of? What international travel is likely to take a long time to recover? We need to rely more on local tourism at a time when disposable income will hit an all-time low. What now? Well, as engaged and as Schindler's and in IQ, in fact, all the partners, we've been racking our brain on, what does one do in the context of hospitality. And I spoke to a psychologist who made a very, very interesting point. He said that our lives are regulated by desires. Everything we do is underpinned by desire. Now, the desires that one has to take into account in this new world order is the desire to not get infected, the desire to be safe, and you have those desires. But a desire that's going to remain is the desire to have a King Steer burger, the desire to have a McDonald's burger. Those desires are going to remain. So now what we know is that there is this desire, and that desire is going to remain with the general populace. But there's been a recalibration of how to get there. So the big question and the way to formulate the solution to this is to recognize that the desires remain, and how does one now bridge the gap? So if the desire remains and one needs to assess, and you'll hear about this, needs, interests, and concerns, because this is what the COBRA mediators are there to do. But when one marries up the desires or the needs, interests, concerns of clients with those of the restaurant, one can achieve a resurrection of the business. We as COBRA, we're about to lobby government to uplift or make a plan in relation to food deliveries, because that is a solution. It deals with the needs, interests, and concerns of the clients and gets the restaurants up and running. So COBRA is, we've got a lobbyist. Her name's Chantal Gladwin. Unfortunately, she's not on today because she was with our judge president, in fact. And that is part of what COBRA is going to do, is to lobby. But on the score of reinventing, Grant, if I'm going to ask you, now Grant is a business rescue practitioner who is one of the directors at Engaged, and he himself has been involved in the hospitality business or the industry for about 20 years, having run restaurants himself. Grant, are you there?
Maurice, hi.
Hi. Grant, we've been dealing with rescue businesses in distress, restaurant businesses in distress over the last 2 weeks. I know you've had quite a few discussions with the owners, and we had a discussion yesterday around your thinking, and I'd like you to share that with our audience today. What is Engage doing, and how is Engage thinking, and what is Engage saying to business owners at the moment?
Thanks, Maurice. Perfect. I'm just reading one or two of the Q&As that are coming through here. There's already a party here saying they've got a group of restaurants. I'm not going to mention any names, but just where the landlord comes up as the topic of conversation here. And I think that's what we should open up our conversation with here. Step one is how we deal with the landlords. Now, from Engage perspective, what we found across our restaurants outside of COVID-19 that we've been dealing with in the past as business rescue practitioners is to sit down and approach this meaningfully with the landlord himself. And that we have seen as it's the biggest gambit that works well with the interaction to get the landlord to sit down and actually understand the issue from both sides of the story. So we get the landlord to understand what's going on with the restaurant, as well as the restaurant owner to understand what's going on with the landlord from a value level. So call it a facilitative level so that we know what the needs, intents, and concerns are across the individual landlord as well as that of the restaurant. So we can sit and understand what the landlord's costing is, because remember, he's also got a business. He's also in the same stress as the restaurant. He's now not getting rental. He's got a bond to pay. He's got his facilities to run. He's got his offices to run. So we try to get an understanding of what the landlord's, let's call it bottom line cost is, and then get a working relationship between the restaurant owner as well as the landlord himself. So I know Ian Fleming's online as well. He went through another restaurant scenario that we did as an initiative. We come right back down to what we refer to as a variable cost model. That's what we get into on step one, on day one with the landlord to drive it forward to know what's the costing in across both bases. So that's
can I stop you there, because flowing from our discussion yesterday where you raised this, and the mediators at COBRA, their job is to work on the debtor-creditor relationship, which would be the landlord-tenant relationship here. But what I did, Grant, is I looked at, I went into the history of basically hospitality, and I came across the origins of the pub as we know it. And the pub started out as a public house. And I'll read to you from some of the research I did. A public house is the kind of bar in the UK that originated as a house that was public. In other words, it was a house where the owner had his friends around for drinks and food and ended up turning it into a business. So what happened is the pub actually emerged by the landowner developing a business out of it. And the landowner, the land was very much part of the business. And as to jump ahead here, definition of a landlord is a person who owns and runs a pub in the UK. So a landlord also applies to a pub owner. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because isn't the solution to enter into a form of a JV with the landlord, isn't the solution for them to actually appreciate that they have the symbiotic relationship, that their interests are aligned. If the one succeeds, the other one succeeds. If the one fails, the other one fails. And what I've come up with, and I haven't discussed it with any of the panelists yet, but I'm thinking that what COBRA must do, and we'll start drafting it today, is to put together what is in essence a JV agreement of sorts. And we can debate this, but you enter into an agreement with the landlord where the landlord actually works with you and there's transparency in relation to where you both are financially. And you reach a compromise where the landlord's, the tenant's restaurant business, let's say, as it succeeds, well, the rental goes up commensurately, and if it doesn't do well, it goes down. But in the JV agreement, we can also have a protective mechanism for the landlord, a right of first refusal. So let's say the landlord can find another tenant to take the place of the restaurant. Well, then the landlord can say to the existing tenant, the existing business owner, look, this arrangement doesn't work any longer. I have found somebody else. What's nice about that is the interim arrangement then keeps the tension between the landlord and the restaurant at a low, and they can then look at mothballing the restaurant, keeping the expenses at a minimum just so that they can survive. And then when the economic climate springs back to normality, they can start trading straight away. That was quite a mouthful, Grant, but you see where I'm going with it.
Maurice, 100% agree. And I mean, it's a superb idea that you've got floating around there. And I recommend we probably get moving on that rather sooner than later, because just to sum up, to shorten for the panel group, what you've just said is we need a team action, a team event here between landlord and restaurant, because I'm not going to mention any shopping centers or malls or areas, but take a sizable center. If 30 restaurants have to all of a sudden close down and leave that sector or that tenant base for that landlord, it's not like there's going to be a queue now walking up to come open up another 30 new restaurants in this current economy that we're in. So getting teamwork together and having the landlord work with the restaurateur or the restaurateur work with the landlord where we can reach amicable agreement between the two parties, I think it's a superb idea to drive this venture forward, to get the parties to work together on a month-by-month basis, if that's what it's going to take, until life, in inverted commas, returns back to normal, where then it is not fair for the landlord to have a lower rental that covers his costs if the restaurant is now operating at full capacity again and things are back to normal. Then the model must change again. But in the interim, let's say over the short period, 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 months, I think it's a marvelous idea, and it's got a hell of a lot of weight to carry on. At the same time, I know we can get into this conversation later on, but we mustn't also forget the operation side of the restaurants and the business itself. So we can touch on those points later, but I don't know when you want, but let's carry on with this landlord's intervention to aid and assist that of the restaurant. Peter, I don't know if you have any points on that.
Don't you? Look, I mean, one thing, I have had an inquiry from somebody that owns a number of restaurants, and one of the landlords has just been bloody minded, excuse the language. And that is going to sometimes be the case. And in that scenario, I just remind us all, we do have Chapter 6 of the Companies Act. So we can still, notwithstanding working through the COBRA process, one can still enter business rescue if you've got a landlord who's just refusing to negotiate. And we will, and Grant, as you rightly say, it might well be because he's been driven by his own financial issues, but still, he's you get that situation where people dig a trench and aren't prepared to come out of it. So if that is the case, business rescue. Maurice, could I just pick up one point with you that you mentioned on the JV side, is that one of the things for a restaurant, obviously, is security of tenure. And if we're giving the landlord through a JV the option to turn up and say, listen, notwithstanding there's not going to be a queue of new people wanting to open up restaurants, so it's probably a little bit academic. But how does the tenant, then deal with the fact that he could be told, well, you need to get out because I found somebody else? Bear in mind, a restaurant, one of the biggest capital costs is the fitment of the restaurant on day one.
Yeah, good question. I think what we need to recognize is that in any scenario, one must treat it as trying to explore the lesser of various evils. Okay, so the evil there would be the tenant being able to maintain the business, a mothballed business, but keep it going, as opposed to a failed business rescue and a liquidation. So the tenant will have that. What's the risk to the tenant? Well, the landlord may find another tenant for the premises, which I think we can all agree would be unlikely in this climate. So what I'm suggesting, and you know, we can debate this, and I'm sure we can improve on the model, but rather have a situation where they work together. There is this form of JV. The landlord says, well, I'm going to accept the arrangement because there's no downside. I'll have a vacant shop if I don't enter into this arrangement, so let's just leave the current tenant in. Yeah, and it's potentially a win-win. Yeah, I think as I said, I think we can improve on the model, but the general idea is to have landlords realize that there's no point in the legal tension because you'd be sucking blood from stone. Rather, try and explore the lesser of the various evils with the tenant. And I have no doubt that the agreements, the JV agreements, will be different on a case-by-case basis. But the principle there is important, and that is to avoid the tensions. And you mentioned Chapter 6, and I think that's important. We've had landlords who, historically, landlords have the bargaining power when it comes to a tenant who cannot pay rent because the landlord can come in and liquidate. Things are very, very different in the current climate. A landlord, if he does liquidate, well, what's in it for the landlord? But one has the moratorium, and the moratorium is, in terms of the sections, in terms of the Companies Act, if the landlord starts becoming unreasonable and starts saying, well, if you don't agree to this remission or you don't do this, and starts becoming heavy-handed, well, at that point, COBRA will put your business into business rescue to level the playing field with the landlord. And that will then cure the disparity in bargaining power. You'll have an impartial mediator, a business rescue practitioner, who will then instill trust between the debtor and creditor, the landlord and the tenant, and hopefully that will achieve an amicable resolution, a win-win resolution for the parties. I don't know, is that, you know, I can't think of a better solution, Peter.
Maurice, yeah, and in fact, I see we've got a comment from Anand, and he makes a good point, which is there are already leases in existence that have a turnover clause. And, you know, if the model that we always try and get to is ideally turning fixed costs, and this includes specifically rent and also labor, trying to turn that into a variable cost, so that if the turnover is not there, the cost isn't there. And obviously a turnover percentage clause in a lease does capture that to some degree. What it doesn't do is, you know, most landlords would have a safety net. So if your turnover is, as it is right at the moment, zero, you're probably still caught up in a rental payment. And from that point of view, I agree with you, Maurice. I mean, I think we're trying to decide on the lesser of two evils at the moment. But, you know, I think from a restaurant point of view, when you sunk a few millions into the fitment, one's got to get your head around how to use that to best advantage and not be too protective of it as regards a challenge from the landlord.
Everything we do is about finding middle grounds. And you know, the win-win situation here and the trade-off is that the tenant gets flexibility and he gets a lower cost base. So he gets variability in his costs. So when his turnover drops, then his costs become lower. In exchange, and he gets the landlord off his back, which is a big pressure for most of the guys at the moment. In exchange for that, the landlord retains the right to find a new tenant if a strong tenant comes in who can afford to pay the normal rent. So there's a trade-off in everything, but I do believe, as Marisa said, this is the best middle ground to be found in this situation.
How have you found the landlords, Ian?
Maurice, it's very much dependent upon how much pressure they're under themselves, and as Grant correctly pointed out earlier, every landlord, people tend to think that the landlord is just the guy with all the money and he's got no worries of his own, but every landlord is under pressure himself from his creditors and his shareholders in turn. So it really comes down to a landlord will grant relief to his debtors to the extent that his creditors are granting him relief. And in general, the landlords have been fairly reasonable at the moment, but there are some who are making a lot of noise and threatening eviction and so on. So look, in general, everybody understands the situation that we're in, and everybody's sort of trying to work together. But there are quite a number of exceptions.
Yeah, I think it's important to mention that that's what COBRA's, the idea behind COBRA is for COBRA to pre-business rescue and is to have each company, each business enter the ecosystem. So let's say you're a restaurant and you enter the ecosystem. Now you've got a landlord who is knocking on your door. What we then do is we try and mediate that tension, mediate that arrangement, and then we go to the landlord and say, well, you are in the ecosystem now. Let us look to the banks and let's see what arrangement we can come up with the banks, and then we bring the banks to the party. So the idea is to have this cascading, this waterfall, all the way down to, let's say, the basic business, the hawker, the spaza shop, and then go up and to negotiate or mediate the tensions that ordinarily arise between a debtor and a creditor. I mean, I think the audience must realize that those tensions would serve absolutely no purpose. This is a no-fault based situation. So it's just a case of, as I've said, mitigating the effects of this disaster. Yeah, I want to just jump back to you, Grant. We were talking about solutions yesterday. Now, I see there have been quite a few questions that have been asked, and the general question is, how does one pivot? And you had some ideas around that. Grant?
Perfect, Maurice. I just want to jump back onto, just close off on Ian's point there, back to landlords before we get onto some form of the operations and ideas and new ways of doing business. Just from if we do have any landlords on the line, is in Engaged previous history, whenever we've negotiated with the landlord to come to a meaningful arrangement where we've succeeded and numerous times, even if we've had to have the company in business rescue, is just from the perspective of utilities. I don't want any of the restaurant group there to think that lights, water, utility factor, rates, taxes are excluded from that count. Those we always put in as a cost. And that's part of control that we can get down to an operation. So we don't strip that out of the number. That is something that has to be paid by the restaurateur. We can't have a factor on electricity and water. If it's used, it needs to be paid for. That goes without saying. And we've always stood by that arrangement in all our agreements where we've reached agreement with landlord, just to put that on the table and make sure everyone understands that. In terms of operations and models where we can go down and do things differently, myself and Peter were talking about it earlier, is to something as simple as a freezer. Well, let's turn down the level of that freezer. Some of these large restaurant chains are having massive walk-in freezers. Operate those things at the lowest level required to draw less energy, therefore saving costs. So we can run through a number of operating models. As we're looking into the future now. Let's assume restaurants do reopen in the next 3 to 6 weeks. There's going to have to be some form of clause on table spacing. We're not going to be able to walk into a restaurant where tables are right next door to each other. Can we put perspex boarding up between tables? Let's keep tables separated. We've got to start thinking out of the box to look at the ventures going forward. And if I can bring in this point now, between Engaged and IQ Business Group, we've already started, let's call it process mapping and process initiatives of new business models for the hospitality and restaurant groups across the country on how to deal with the restaurants on a new mechanism. Hence, temperature control at doors. Show that your staff are tested. I mean, I can get right down to models where we have freezers at the doors where a customer, where you normally walk up to a sign that says, please wait to be seated. when you please wait to be seated, you actually take your own wine glass out of a fridge where there is no potential a virus sitting on the glass, and you walk that glass to your table where you're going to be seating. So we've got a whole range of models. Obviously, this is an incredibly growing environment on how to do things differently from an operational perspective. Before we even worry about getting into the control and actual underlying operations, our number one motto here is if we can get the landlord to work with the restaurateur, and again, the restaurateur to work with the landlord, it makes keeping that restaurant operating a lot easier down the line with the anticipated new changes that are imminent. We're not going to be able to go back into a restaurant on the same basis anymore. Maurice, I don't know if that answers your question, just a few touch points on where we're working on a new business, call it strategy, with IQ Business Group to come up with a new format of how restaurants must run.
Yeah, no, that's key.
Sorry, Maurice. If I can just add to that, it's quite an interesting one. Primarily because, again, is that we probably haven't spent enough time asking ourselves around what experience people were looking for in restaurants to begin with. And if you look at some of the retailers, for example, like Woolworths has done, is that they've opened a small kind of restaurant or coffee type of a setup within the retailing structure, primarily to inform the kind of consumer that's probably eating on the go, but not necessarily there for the full experience. And so it's an understanding that there are interesting opportunities to understand how do you start to solve for the, an alternative, I think, dining experience, if we can call it that, for some of the restaurants in the event that the restauranting model does open. One of the questions that also came from Henry Koch, was around, food delivery innovations and trying to remain competitive in this current landscape. I think it's also quite interesting if we could look at, how do you then support the health facilities that are still very human capital heavy right now. And so I think often we've wanted to, I guess, focus on people, being the one who source out the food delivery service. Yet there certainly, I think, are going to be interesting opportunities now and say, how do we package, for example, prepackaged health or immuno-boosting prepackaged meals for the health facilities that are going to be inundated in this economy. I think those are some of the interesting innovations that you could start thinking about in the context of that as well.
Sifiso, whilst I've got you on, what are your thoughts around food delivery and the basic fast food? Your Steers, your Nando's. I mean, surely they're going to immediately get back or very close to where they used to be, even if they don't have walk-ins, because there's no option there. If people want Steers burger, they're going to have to go through a delivery service. Surely that's isn't it really the big restaurants that are going to be in trouble because of their leasing costs? I'll also throw this out to Ian and Grant. I mean, what are your views?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the current landscape is certainly going to change the entire real estate model. I think now even businesses outside of the hospitality space are starting to see that they can partially operate without the big fixed costs of from a real estate point of view, and so it's going to be quite interesting to see then how the retailers now and the landlords actually think about what does it mean to be I think dynamic in terms of how you offer retailing, particularly fast food retailing space, given I think the current context of our economy. But I think certainly it's not going to be an easy transition. But if we start thinking around the fact that the real estate model as it was won't be sustainable, and I think that's a very productive conversation that can be had with landlords around what does it mean to have a retail version of a hot desk, for example.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, it's the moment one appreciates that retail is going to change dramatically. In light of this, the question is, what's going to replace it? I mean, what are we going to see in Sandton City in a year's time when one walks through there? I mean, it's going to be a very different landscape.
Well, the buildings are not, the buildings are not going to go away, Maurice. The fact of the matter is the only choice that people will have is for landlords and tenants to start working together, and for the landlords to effectively have a more vested interest in the success of the tenant. And thus the joint venture that you've been proposing, and what I was calling the variable cost model, where the landlord helps the tenant in bad times, and then when when things are good and the tenant's business is flying, then the landlord benefits from that. I honestly think that's the only way it can work.
Maurice, that's an interesting point that Ian makes there, because from our banking days, when you're funding a large retail development, one of the things that you look at from a risk point of view is alternative use. So, a hotel can be turned into an apartment block, etc. And on the retail side, one's got to look at or more commercial, firstly, or more community type uses. So your gyms will still continue probably using up large spaces. Obviously, a place like Sandton City is almost impossible to convert totally. But your medium-sized retail centers might well be looking at alternative use over the longer period. I'm not talking about in the next 2-3 years. But as rentals aren't where they were last year, then we might well see a change of use.
Yeah, certainly.
Maurice?
And yeah, sorry,
Sorry, Maurice, I just want to jump back to your question there quickly on the difference between, let's call it a Nando's and a Steers, where we do have the massive delivery services already in place, to a bigger store. The big impact that we're working with IQ on at the moment to come up with this new model as well is, we don't know what the rules are going to be, but if we can anticipate that the week prior to shutdown, where all restaurants had to cease alcohol trading at 6 o'clock in the evening, we've got to take cognizance in these big restaurants that they actually make the significant portion of their revenue off alcohol sales in the evening. That's where the cash comes from. They're not there just from a food base based on the size of the operations. So that entire model, to Peter's comment and as well as Safiso's comment, that retail model from a restaurant perspective is going to have to fundamentally change, assuming we're going to start cutting back on either number of people in the restaurant or cutting out alcohol sales post 6-7 o'clock in the evening. It's going to have a massive effect on the revenue stream available for those restaurants. Hence the reason why we need this relationship between restaurant and landlord to continue the ongoing nature of the business.
Just on the, do you foresee the alcohol ban continuing indefinitely?
I don't foresee indefinitely, but in the short term, Maurice, I mean, there is comments out there, just reading in the newspapers as well, that the alcohol sales, if you just listen to the government as well as to our police minister, there's zero interest in lifting this alcohol ban, although there's massive tabling and lobbying for it. So we anticipate that there's a possibility that you're not going to have, in other words, they'll herd you back into the restaurant game. Not everything just opens up and it's stock standard how it was 1 week before lockdown. There's almost going to be a slow initiative to get back into restaurants. Like, I can't see them allowing all of a sudden 1,000 people to walk into a big nightclub again and just allow that to happen. We've got to keep all social distancing. So with that, you've got to combine the lesser volume of alcohol being sold, and your large restaurant chains with big floor space, money is made off alcohol sales. That is the cash generator on those restaurants.
Just on I'll ask Ian. I think you're now involved in a rescue. The landlords come to the party. The business is not in business rescue, and the shareholder wants to put money in. Now, what's important for the audience is take note. What does one do if the business is not in rescue? The landlords come to the party, but the shareholder wants to put money in. Yeah.
It's important to remember, Maurice, that when a company is in business rescue, whoever puts money in after it's in business rescue enjoys preference of repayment of that money. In other words, their loans rank above everybody else's loans. In other words, the pre-business rescue loans. So whereas it is very clearly stated by COBRA that the aim is not to put companies into business rescue and to keep them, to deal with all the interested parties pre-business rescue, to solve the problems of the companies pre-business rescue. We must realize that business rescue is a tool that can be used. It's a very strong, a steel jacket, as Peter calls it, a protection mechanism, and it gives the lender of what we call post-commencement finance, in other words, financing that comes into the business after the commencement of business rescue, gives them seniority in terms of repayment. So if you're a shareholder and you want to put money into the business to pay salaries or whatever, it is better to do it under business rescue, because then you will be repaid before everybody else. In business rescue, the repayment of your loan will rank right at the top, immediately below the business rescue practitioner's fees and disbursements. Should, for whatever reason, the company end up going into liquidation, heaven forbid, then if the money that you put in is secured by an asset in the business, then you will enjoy the most senior level in the repayment waterfall. In other words, in a liquidation scenario, secured post-commencement finance is the first finance to be repaid. Then the business rescue practitioner's fees and remunerations drop to the bottom of the list. So yeah, having the company in business rescue, especially if you're going to put money in afterwards and you can secure that money by an asset in the business, that puts you in the most favorable position, as opposed to putting in money before business rescue or without the company being in business rescue.
Maurice, just to add on that from what Ian's saying, and obviously the first port of call is if you don't wish to go into rescue, and this sounds a bit daft to say because shareholders should know what is owned by the company, but shareholders often forget. As a shareholder, you can take security over any of the assets in the business. So, even outside of rescue, there's nothing to stop a shareholder putting money in and taking some type of security over the assets of the business, just in case it does go into liquidation. At least you're a secured creditor.
Yeah, no, good point. But I'm gonna mention suretyships, because I think that's going to be on everybody's mind. If you have signed surety as a director shareholder, let's say to the landlord or to the bank, that surety, even if you're in business rescue, can still be enforced by the lender. So what if you're going to be settling, you're liable personally. My suggestion, Peter, is if you're going to be settling that debt, rather settle it by lending the money to the company in business rescue, so you get that preference and then settle the debt, as opposed to something which you could quite easily do, and that is the surety saying, okay, I'm liable, and simply paying the settling the debt, but not through the company. Am I correct, Peter, that if the surety were to just pay directly, it wouldn't be PCF?
Absolutely. And I mean, it's a good point. What you're doing is re-establishing or establishing a new obligor under the debt arrangement. So instead of you having forked out cash and got nothing in return, you fork out cash to the company in rescue, which then pays the debt and settles the debt. Now we deal with this quite often and try and bring, essentially, as I said earlier, we always try and take a collaborative approach. So if a shareholder or director unfortunately finds they are faced with personal sureties, is to bring them into the rescue, is exactly as you say, by way of them injecting cash, and we're assuming they've got cash. But even if they haven't got cash, what often is the case is an individual is terrified they're going to lose the family home, because that's their only asset. And if there's a blanket guarantee given to the bank or the landlord, whoever else, the family residence could be put under the auctioneer's hammer. So by remortgaging your property, taking that cash and putting it into a company in rescue, do not put that money into the company unless it's in rescue, because obviously by default, it's already been challenged. And thereby making sure that if the rescue works, you're going to get your money back and you've got a personal suretyship off your back. Important though, it's a very clear indication by a shareholder or director that they firmly believe that the company is rescuable. And I think that's one of the problems that we've had with rescues is very often they aren't rescuable, and people just believe by putting it into rescue, they're going to sort all their problems out. Well, that's also silly. You know, the company has to have a chance, and really the only issue is where it finds itself as of today or within the next 6 months, it's going to be in trouble. And beyond that, it can certainly trade out of the situation. Then that's an ideal rescue to do.
Have you, and this is off topic, or it's a new topic, which has arisen in previous webinars, and that's the question of the business rescue practitioner's investigative powers. And what happens, I mean, we've seen it in the hospitality business. There was a restaurant chain, I recall about 15 years ago, that was bust by the South African Revenue Services having double sets of books. There may be restaurants out there who have this concern that if a business rescue practitioner or a liquidator comes in, they have certain reporting obligations. Can you comment on that?
It's one of the big differences between a liquidator and a business rescue practitioner. The practitioner has the obligation to investigate in terms of Chapter 6. If he or she finds that something has been done which is contrary to the law, he or she is then obligated to make sure that management desists from doing so, whatever that might be, and then report it to the authorities. It doesn't specify who the authority is. You could go down to the local police station and report it there. The depth of investigation, the business rescue practitioner has full rights to call in forensic auditors to delve deep. I've dealt with 2 of these in my past. One's ongoing where we have had fraud, and I've used forensic auditors to get to the bottom of what the issues are, and I reported them. The one was controlled by the FSCA. It's a financial services company. But that's the end of the story. You just make sure that they desist. However, in the hospitality trade and restaurants in particular, family restaurants, it's a classic that cash comes into the business and disappears from the business, often for supplies for the business, but often to keep the family alive. So the double set of books is not an unusual scenario. In that case, obviously, who's been defrauded there is the tax man. So the practitioner has to also be very practical about this. I mean, if you're working with the individual, you can get the figures together and make a declaration to SARS as how this is going to be paid off over a period of time. But I dare say for a lot of the smaller restaurants, and I am talking about the smaller restaurants, this is a concern. That it's the same as if the restaurateur decides to sell his business. Suddenly he's got to disclose to the potential purchaser that there's actually a separate set of books. My approach to this is practical. Every individual is obligated to report matters of crime to the authorities, but you've got to be practical about it and put it in context. If these the guy's partner's cell phones on the business or his kids' cell phones on the business, that's hardly material. And now materiality doesn't necessarily come into the law, but I think from a practical business point of view, you've just got to take a broader view on this and say, is this such a heinous action that, because this restaurant could well collapse as a result? Well, that's surely in contrary to what you're trying to do. If you find it's a can of worms, then I'd go so far as to say maybe liquidation is the better option. But, we try and avoid that at all cases because, believe me, in the current market, in normal market, trying to put catering equipment from a restaurant in an auction, that you're going to get probably 10% of its true value. So, you try and avoid that as much as you can. And even if you do have to sell off the equipment, at least do it under a controlled process with, hopefully a number of people bidding for the same piece of equipment.
There are practical solutions, as Peter was saying. There are practical solutions in situations like this. For example, if a restaurant was supposed to have paid 1,000 rand worth of tax and only paid 100 rand, then you approach SARS, you negotiate with them. We can, in working with the business owner, we can say to SARS, we were supposed to have paid you 1,000 rand, so that becomes your balance, your creditor balance as at the beginning of business rescue. But then under business rescue, if all the creditors take a haircut. So essentially we can then once again reduce the SARS liability under business rescue as part of the business rescue plan. So from a very, I suppose it's a very kind of careful way to consider it, but technically that is one way of ensuring that or helping the business owner, seeing as he's in distress, not to actually end up paying more tax as a result of us being of the company being in business rescue.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to mention that a business rescue practitioner is an officer of the court, but these obligations only arise on a business rescue, not prior to a business rescue. So if there are any concerns with any businesses out there, come into the COBRA environment, have a chat. There's no reporting obligation until there is in fact a business rescue. And the idea behind COBRA is to avoid business rescues entirely. Yeah, so that's important. I want to just touch on, we'll go back to the variable costs, Ian, that the idea is to strive to make everything a variable. One obvious one would be staff, and that's generally an enormous fixed cost, and the idea would be to somehow negotiate with the staff to make it variable. And I'd like to introduce the audience to Pierre van der Merwe. He heads up the Labour Department at Schindler's. He's my partner. He's given lectures on this topic exclusively, but I'm going to ask him not to give a lecture, just to give us a rundown of the state of our law in this context.
Thanks, Maurice. Okay, well, the Companies Act deals directly with employees and employment contracts within a business rescue context. So the section that you're going to be looking at is section 136 of the Companies Act. And it does set out fairly clearly what the company's obligations are in relation to employees. So maybe let me just read that first section for you. So despite any provision of an agreement to the contrary, during a company's business rescue proceedings, employees of the company immediately before the beginning of those proceedings continue to be so employed on the same terms and conditions, except to the extent that, 1, changes occur in the ordinary course of attrition, or 2, the employees and the company, in accordance with applicable labor laws, agree different terms and conditions, and any retrenchments of any such employees contemplated in the company's business rescue plan is subject to section 189 or 109A of the Labour Relations Act and any other applicable employment-related legislation. So what does that mean? It means that when a company goes into business rescue, everything as far as an employment relationship perspective stays the same. It's the same terms and conditions, except to the extent that changes occur in the ordinary course of attrition. So what does attrition mean? It means the ordinary sort of loss of employees through the ordinary course. So employees that might ordinarily resign or ordinarily be dismissed for misconduct or whatever the case may be, but it means in the ordinary sense. And importantly, it means where employees are specifically not reappointed. So if you lose an employee for whatever reason, that you don't fill that position again during the business rescue process, obviously to save costs, salary costs, if possible and if applicable. And the other aspect is also that any retrenchment, any change in terms and conditions of employment have to be in terms of the ordinary applicable labor laws. So that generally envisages a consultation process within the business rescue process. So that would be a consultation usually by a representative of the employees and the business rescue practitioner, where you could discuss that and consult with the employees to see whether it is possible to change those terms and conditions of employment. But importantly, I mean, it's almost nice that you can rely on the labor law and the provisions of the Companies Act, because the same principles apply to your employment relationship during the business rescue process. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think you know, there's a dilemma that we've been discussing on the webinars, and that is, you've got to, in terms of Section 189, you've got to consult with employees in order to unilaterally vary their employment terms. If they do not agree, the alternative to the variation is a dismissal based on operational grounds. But what if you cannot afford the severance pay in those circumstances? What does one do then? And that's why it's unreasonable employees who do not agree and who decide, no, they're going to hold out and they want their retrenchment packages, may in fact get less, because that may lead to the businesses, in fact, it would lead to the business's liquidation. So it's quite important for the employees to understand that. And when it comes to dealing with the employees, that's why a business rescue practitioner needs to work with those employees, needs to get their trust. I'll mention a restaurant in Camps Bay that we were involved in a business rescue because it couldn't keep its head above water because of high rentals. And what happened was, went into business rescue. The primary concern, in fact, the business rescue practitioner is one of our panelists today. One of the primary concerns was the staff. And the business rescue practitioner, he met with the staff, gave them comfort in the fact that this involved a meeting with the landlord. He met with the landlord, negotiated a reduced rental, and was pulled out of business rescue. Ian, tell me about how you deal with staff. Can't hear you.
Ian, you're still muted.
Sorry about that. Maurice, you're talking about practically in the business rescue as a matter of process.
Yes, like so let's say through COBRA, we decide, because of an unreasonable landlord, to put the company into business rescue. Now you've been appointed as a business rescue practitioner. Tell us what happens apropos the staff.
Right, we get appointed as a business rescue practitioner. Within 10 days, we have to hold the first meeting of creditors and a meeting with employee representatives. If the employees are represented by a trade union, then we meet with the trade union. And if the employees are not represented by a trade union, then we meet with a representative of the employees. And the purpose of both meetings is really just to inform them as to whether the business rescue practitioner believes there's a reasonable prospect of rescuing the business. And for the employees, it's specifically about whether they'll retain their jobs and so on. At that meeting, we normally quite open with them, quite tactful at the same time, bearing in mind the position that they're in, as to what the prospects for rescuing the business are, and how we intend to go about it. The employees are affected persons in the business rescue. In other words, they enjoy the same rights as creditors and shareholders in the business rescue, and they need to be they thus need to be part of the process of being invited, looking at the business rescue, considering the business rescue plan and so on, if they are creditors of the company.
Great. I think it would be useful to now turn to some of the questions, which I'll direct to the panelists. I see there's one here that's the implications of personal surety. We've dealt with that. We already have turnover clauses as this possible partnership role to work together to grow sales and mutually benefit. I'm not sure. Yeah, so the idea there is with the JV is to do precisely that, to get into the variable relationship with with the landlord. Landlord, the funds from banks available given new liquidity rules, so it's easier against the fixed property for the landlord to take a longer term view and trade out of the crisis. Absolutely. Can we get government support to SMMEs or give preference to locally manufactured PPE products? This will make it easier for some of the SMMEs to survive the lockdown. This is the kind of these are the kind of points that are important, and we'd ask that you reach out so we understand the circumstances and the point you're trying to make. Because as we mentioned, we do have a lobbyist, and the idea is to lobby government. So we say, can we get government? We certainly can try to get government if it makes commercial sense, taking into account obviously the risks of the virus. Can the landlord perfect their hypothec in business rescue? Can I be evicted in business rescue? So I'm going to just deal with the second aspect, and then I'll move to you, Peter, in relation to the hypothec question. Can I be evicted in business rescue? Very, very important question. And one of the take-homes that we ask that you make a big note of is if you're not going to go into, if you're not going to utilize the COBRA environment for business rescue, and you're going to appoint a business rescue practitioner outside of the environment, make sure that the business rescue practitioner is clued up when it comes to the suspension of contracts. You have to send a notice to suspend contracts even if the moratorium applies to a business rescue. So if you have a lease agreement, the lease will carry on running unless the business rescue practitioner sends a notice and says, we're suspending. So there can be an eviction in business rescue if the business rescue practitioner doesn't suspend. The landlord then terminates and then evicts. There's a judgment by Judge Barachovitz which granted an eviction in those circumstances. Peter, you deal with a hypothec, the question of a hypothec in business rescue.
Maurice, yes, look, the landlord's hypothec falls into exact same conditions as any other piece of security, other than, you know, in a landlord's hypothec case, it has certain values attached to it which are driven by the lease itself. But the principle is that all security is not cancelled, it's merely frozen. So can the landlord exercise his hypothec subject to what Maurice has just said on the suspension of the contract? The answer is no. Same as you've given the bank a mortgage over the company's premises, and the bank cannot foreclose on that and put the property under the up for auction through a liquidation process. Can't do that. Cannot, as we say, steel jacket over this company, cannot touch it from a legal point of view. In the creation of the business rescue plan, then, a practical thing is we will acknowledge the hypothec, of course, if it's valid. I mean, we will check all agreements to make, and this is a space where we've spent quite a bit of time making absolutely certain that everybody that says they're a secured creditor, in my time I've seen certain pieces of paper that people claim as security, and they get filed in file 13 fairly rapidly because they're not worth the paper they're written on. So assuming that it is a valid piece of security, i.e. a valid lease, then the landlord's hypothec exists, and one acknowledges that, so he's a secured creditor. And then in the plan, you work out how you're going to settle that liability. Ian talked earlier, if you're asking the creditors to take a compromise, i.e. you're only paying them a percentage of what they were owed as at the date of rescue, then you've got to consider what that hypothec means. So it is an individual negotiation with the landlord. They're in a sort of separate category, if you like, in our negotiation, same as the banks are in a different category. And we will make sure that, you know, the landlord is satisfied, because remember what I said right at the beginning, you have to have this plan voted on. And if the landlord's a creditor, which he very often is, then he has a say in the structure of the plan. So it's important to get the landlord on board. Obviously, if you haven't suspended the contract, then the landlord claims, well, I've continued providing you services post-rescue, so I'm now actually a post-rescue funder, and I'm going to exercise my rights in terms of that post-rescue funding, which is, you know, continuing to occupy his property and apply to the courts for exercise of my hypothec and eviction.
Great, thanks for that. There are several questions, one by Pamina and one from Mario, in relation to, in essence, what do restaurants do with this paradigm shift? And I just want to mention innovation. And prior to this COVID virus, I attended the Singularity University course. And the Singularity University is a San Francisco-based university that deals with exponential technologies and where the world is going and how we ought to adapt regardless of a corona, because of exponential technology taking jobs, changing industries, etc., etc. And they use an example of what killed the spice trade. The spice trade was there because people believed that it prevented food from getting rotten. And what killed the spice trade was ice. A chap decided to move ice from the north down to Saint Martin, and that ice killed the spice trade because it could preserve foods, and it started with an ice box and then it became the refrigerator. And they posed the question at Singularity University, what is going to kill the refrigerator? And what is going to kill the refrigerator? I've got absolutely no doubt the audience believes nothing will kill the refrigerator. And in fact, the arguments made, and they reckon within the next 10 years, what's conceivably going to kill the refrigerator is drones. Because drone delivery will be so quick that you'll be able to get your fresh milk, your fresh bread within 10, 15 minutes if you live in an urban area. So these technologies, exponential technology was doing it anyway, and there had to be these paradigm shifts in any event that one had to look at to change with the times. And that's the kind of thinking that one must employ at the moment, is one ought to have been thinking in this direction in any event, but now one requires some urgent deep thinking as to how to recreate the models. Don't know if any of you want to comment on that, but
Mauricio, I mean, one, you know, you're talking about a technological change there, but I have a friend who's got a pub in the UK, in the West Country in the UK, and what he did, he knows his customers, and this is what's going to, I suspect, happen in the restaurant business, is the local restaurants who know their customers, and by saying know their customers, I mean have got their email addresses or telephone numbers, will manage to survive through this, because what this pub has done is they are now producing, everybody knows what their menu is, so they send their menu out as a reminder. They are then producing bespoke meals and delivering those meals to their customers. So the customers are still enjoying their food. Now they've become a catering business rather than a pub. But, you know, and it's not there forever and a day. So one's got to look at this, because I saw there was a question, you know, if you're a large restaurant and you're only doing 3% of your turnover by way of Uber or takeouts, it's very difficult to pivot that restaurant. Yes, it most certainly is, but, and this also answers a question about labor. And we say it even in normal business rescue situations, hang on to your cash as long as you can. Now, just on a labor example, I've had a lot of people saying, but I've just forced my staff to take leave. Well, that's not a clever thing to do, because you're still paying them whilst they're on leave. Rather than negotiate with them, as we were talking, Pierre was talking about earlier, to take a reduction in salary now, let them have their leave at a normal period, but leave you're not paying out at full whack. Rather than negotiate that you're going to pay them 30% during this period of crisis, and hang on to that 70% to cover whatever those other black swans are going to come swimming at you that you weren't expecting. So, and the same for the food in the hospitality industry. Look at where cash is coming from, and try and maximize that as best you can. And as Ian said, reduce your costs into a variable cost, but reduce those costs generally. You know, Ian was talking about, or rather Grant was talking about the issue of what is your freezer running at? How much gas are you know, how many restaurants do we know that are on gas? The staff come in first thing in the morning and turn all the cookers on and leave them running for the entire day, because it's too much of a hassle to turn it on plate by plate. Make sure that those sort of things aren't happening. So conserve your cash and keep it in the bank for when you're going to desperately need it.
Yeah, just to add on to that, Maurice and Peter, I think, the interesting thing about innovation also is around how well are you able to utilize your immediate resources, right? And I make the example of, banana cakes. We historically had, for example, street vendors who would sell fruit, and banana would probably be the first to go overripe. But we know that in banana cake, you need an overripe banana because of its sugar content. And all of a sudden now, there's an opportunity to create an offtake market for something that would have ordinarily gone into a waste market. And so these are some of the thinkings, I think, that we're also trying to encourage around, how do you look at your immediate resources in an innovative way that can actually enable you, for example, to start an entire food culture? Because easily now, for example, one region could become the largest maker of banana cake in the country, primarily because they found a way of taking what would have ordinarily been waste and converted that into a market opportunity. And that's the first thing. I think the second one is, also quite closely tied to what Peter was talking around, information being a currency. So I think, a lot of businesses may have probably taken for granted the kind of information that they were sitting on. And now might be an important time to look at, for example, what were your sales trends, for example? At what time did people consume what kind of food and what kind of beverages, etc.? And maybe you could actually, again, do some tailored solution based on what those trends actually look like when you actually look around how people interacted with the service that you were offering. So that's, again, a backward-looking view around how people previously interacted with your business to inform, I think, a new market positioning that you'd be looking at advantage of.
Yeah, no, brilliant. Thanks for that, Sifiso. Peter, there's a follow-up question that's been directed to you. Sorry. Whilst you follow on that, I'm also going to point out, so you can also deal with it, the question by Erwin in relation to, following from that, if the restaurant entity owns its own business and property, this is in relation to post-commencement finance, and if the property is a bond, will the putting in of the funds post-business rescue, will the repayment of the post-BR loan trump the bond?
Maurice, thanks. I'm going to deal with mine first because I'm grey-haired enough to forget questions, and I've already answered Erwin. So at least I can read off what I wrote to him on the screen. One thing that you're going to find, I'm talking about a little local restaurant who knows his customers well. He's got a specific cuisine. It's Italian, it's French, whatever. Survival rates are, it's an easier thing to try and work out an alternative, as Sifiso says, to pivot off that. But just think of your large restaurants, your well-known, top-rated restaurants in this town, who deal possibly with 80% of their customers they don't know. They're tourists or people who have just heard about the restaurant, so called in. Now, those restaurateurs, I would argue, can easily form some sort of electronic-based educative program to teach their patrons, previous patrons, on how to do this themselves. I mean, imagine that in the new order, that people are sitting around the table and cooking a famous Italian meal or a wonderful Italian meal from a famous restaurant, and being driven by somebody that's talking over the internet through a YouTube presentation on how to do it. Delia Sainsbury, been doing this for donkey's years, as a good South African, learned how to do it in the early days. As regards Erwin's question, just to be clear about this, on the day of rescue, all creditors, including secured creditors, are frozen, cannot exercise their security, cannot take the company to court for recovery of their debt. Post-rescue, anybody putting money in the normal course of business is preferred. So the rescue practitioner has to settle up everybody who put money in after the rescue date before they can start paying creditors that were in existence prior to the rescue date. So obviously, it's a preferred creditor. You are reasonably certain, if the rescue works, of getting paid. However, the practitioner has full access to the assets of the business. So the practitioner can offer up security. So a shareholder who's putting money in should also consider whether they take security post-rescue. And that is super preferent. So that creditor, that post-rescue funder, who's also got security, has got to be paid, obviously, out of the value of that security before anybody else. Now, it could be a second mortgage. So that's going to be a challenge because you've got a first mortgage holder that is pre-rescue, it's the bank. So there has to be something in the plan that allows for the bank to be paid because, as I said, you're not negating their security. So let's say this rescue unfortunately didn't work, the property gets sold, any residue from the sale of the property after the bank has been paid would go towards the second mortgage holder. So yeah, security taken after the date of business rescue is super preferent and will be paid out before everybody else in the rescue itself.
Great.
I think
There's
that's
another question.
There's
Another question by Panos. In your experience, how does BR affect reputation or credit ratings with suppliers, creditors, etc., in the way that you deal with it going forward? So in my experience, there's been one hell of a stigma to business rescue. The moment you go into business rescue, the creditors are up in arms and the situation becomes acrimonious. But having said that, I believe that under the present set of circumstances, there can be no stigma. This is an act of God. It's given rise to business rescue, or the need for business rescue. And that's why we believe at COBRA that we can avoid business rescues. Because if everybody realizes that a business rescue is really unnecessary, if everybody just works together to come up with solutions, then business rescues won't be necessary. A business rescue is only necessary if somebody starts becoming unreasonable. If a creditor starts becoming unreasonable. So that's why we believe the situation is very different and that rescues will not be required in situations where the liabilities exceed the assets or the company is commercially, financially distressed. Yeah, Peter, do you want to comment on that?
Maurice, yes, look, I mean, it's an interesting thing. I'm dealing with one at the moment where the CEO came and he tapped me on the shoulder and he said, "Thank God you're here because that's a lot of pressure off my back." Because when you're an entrepreneur and you're running a business and you've done extremely well, and then suddenly, for whatever reason, however that arose, whether obviously, Maurice, you're right, this is a crisis we're dealing with, but in the normal course, you suddenly find that every person and their dog are phoning up demanding money. Now, there's a limit to how much Mrs. Jones or Mr. Jones in the accounts department can deal with it. So it lands back on the entrepreneur's plate. You promised me and you haven't, and therefore I'm going to, and it becomes very acrimonious. So very often what happens is that the owner of the business feels a huge sense of relief that those creditors can no longer, those telephone calls aren't going to be taken any further. If they are, the practitioner will deal with it and advise, as he's required to do, the creditors that the business is in rescue. And so be it. People can understand the act and you can explain it to them as we are obligated to do as to what their rights and obligations are under rescue, thereby allowing the entrepreneur to get back to the business of running the business and not being bogged down with what he would see as, the administration back office trauma that he's had to deal with in the past. The other intriguing thing, and Ian, I've found this, we work very closely with the banks. Time and time again, we walk into the banks and they say, "Thank God you're on board." We've been told so many stories by these guys that the trust has now been challenged. And so you immediately restoring trust vis-a-vis the banks and possibly creditors and landlords. So that is one of the positives of the rescue. The stigma, the government, sad to say, did this country a huge favor, or did business rescue a huge favor by putting SAA into rescue. This is not a Mickey Mouse business. Now, we all know that it was been on the edge for how many years, but still, it's a massive organization. We've had some large entities. Who would have thought that, Ellerines, Group 5, Basil Reed, who would have thought that these Studdefords, for goodness sake, the 100-year-plus company, went into rescue. Unfortunately, Studdefords didn't work and it went into liquidation. I'm not sure people are aware, but the CEO of Edgar's gave an announcement 2 weeks ago telling all his suppliers he's not going to be able to pay them for their February invoices, and it's unlikely they'll be able to pay right up until the end of April. That's April invoices, not the date of when they're going to pay. And that they are now urgently considering their position, whether they should be going into rescue or not. So, you know, these are not Mickey Mouse operations. And I say to, in fact, Ian and I had a conversation with somebody that came through COBRA to us, never ever apologize for what you did in the past, subject to fraud, of course. If it was just, you know, read the markets incorrectly, didn't do something you should have done, shouldn't have necessarily spent money on the new equipment, etc., etc. On the day, that was a decision taken. And the delight of business rescue is that you've now got not only the protection, but you've also got people, you know, we're not, I mean, Ian and I are both chartered accountants, so is Grant. We're not, you know, chartered, we don't apply an accounting process to this or legal process, whilst we understand the rules and regulations of both. It's about business, and it's about how to help the business to survive, and that's very important to us.
There's a question by Ryan. Can a practitioner assist with insurance claims, clauses of acts of God not regarding not being able to trade? Does the panel have any insight regarding insurance claims and being able to overcome insurers not wanting to pay out? I haven't discussed this, I think, with any of the panel members, maybe with some of my partners, but what we recognize as Schindlers is that there's going to be a need for pro bono services in relation to insurance claims, because a company is not going to be able to sue the insurance company because it's got no funds, because the insurance company hasn't paid out. So the idea would be for depending on the size of the claim and depending on whether the business passes the means test, to actually assist in relation to insurance claims. And we've actually got a seminar on tomorrow, I think, dedicated to insurance and the consequences in relation to the various provisions. You know, for instance, we had a case where the business interruption insurance says it covers any act of God by relating to an animal. Now, a virus is not an animal. Does it apply? And the question arises, well, it did come from an animal. It came from, let's say, a bird. If it was bird flu, in this case, it's the a bat. Yeah. And so it is an animal, but now is that causally connected? Is that sufficiently connected for the purpose of a claim? But I would imagine, Ian, that part of a business rescue plan conceivably could actually be a claim against the insurance company, and only that.
Yes, very much so, Maurice. I've actually had a business rescue a couple of years ago where a huge building had burnt down, a warehouse had burnt down, and a huge insurance claim was awaited. And creditors, because it had taken a while, creditors were getting anxious and starting to threaten liquidation against the company and so on. And we literally had it in business for about 3 weeks, and then the insurance claim paid out. And that was the end of the business rescue, because it covered all the creditors were paid in full. So yeah, we certainly do have those instances where everything just depends on the payout of an insurance claim.
It'll be interesting to see what attitude the insurance industry takes to the crisis, because I've been toying with, is the insurance industry going to suffer, or are they going to benefit? Because if you think about it, at the moment, no one is driving. I mean, the cars are not on the road, yet you're paying the same premium. So there won't be that many claims. I'm just hoping that the insurance industry is going to take a conciliatory approach, not an adversarial approach, and that their policies are going to take into account the needs of society. We have another question, which I'd also like to ask you, Ian. Is there any law protecting restaurants from having to pay rental whilst we can't utilize the premises for the function we rented it for? Our landlord is saying he will utilize our deposit and will have to be paid back over the next 9 months. If you have a function and it's been booked, let's say a wedding function, Ian, and you go into business rescue and the function's in 2 weeks, what do you do?
Well, in that case, if the deposit has been, if a deposit has been paid for the wedding function, then the deposit certainly just becomes a sort of a pre-business rescue creditor. I think, let me just find this question, but I think there's two elements to this, if I understand correctly. There's a common law, so I'm just trying to find that question. Is there not a common law aspect that that allows the because the business can't be used, because the premises can't be used for its intended purposes? Is there not a common law precedent that allows the restaurant to be protected, Maurice?
Well, I would imagine I would imagine that the business continues. Okay, there is a rental, but it's been suspended. You can still use the premises, okay, as part of the business rescue process.
Hmm.
Sure. Yeah, look, I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that we always ask is, people often ask me, do I believe a company is rescuable? And it's a question we have to ask ourselves before we accept the appointment. And we've got 3 days to make that decision as practitioners. But is there still a market for the business? Is the first question that we ask. If the company has a market and people are still prepared to buy, now you've got a wedding function, well, you've already done the sale. You've obviously taken cash up front. You know, if you've got additional cash to come out of that function, sounds a bit critical to say, but if you've still got cash to come, then for goodness sake, try and undertake the function and undertake your obligations to get further cash in. So you've already bought the stock, you've got the labor on board, the staff that can wait at the tables or whatever is required, then try and progress with it, because it's business as usual. You're trying to perform your functions and get as much money in as you can. If on the other case, this is a sad story where, you know, deposits have been taken and the money's all been lost, and you haven't got the stuff and you can't buy it in, and, you know, it's imminent, it's unlikely the practitioner, unless the shareholder is prepared to put money into the company post-rescue, that you're going to be able to fund the purchases for the function, then unfortunately the function is cancelled and the person took their risk. It's what I always say, you know, one of the most difficult businesses to rescue is any that have taken deposits up front. Because if you're in rescue and you're South African Airways, are you going to pay for your ticket up front with South African Airways? A travel agent, are you going to give the travel agent your money if the travel agent tells you in the rescue? Another important point, I mean, interesting enough, the Act is very clear that you have to advise all your creditors that the company's in rescue, and you've got 10 days to do that as practitioner, and there's a formal meeting that has to be called, but you don't have to advise your customers. Now, for a cash in the door retail restaurant type operation, you don't have to advise your customer as they walk in that you're in rescue. There must be a notice somewhere in the premises, normally stuck below that health and safety certificate or the commencement of trade or incorporation certificate that's framed somewhere in the offices. You stick a label below that saying in rescue. The Act also says that if you're in the electronic media, that you should state in that electronic media. So if you've got a web page, you should put there that the company is in rescue. A lot of companies, as a result, certainly the smaller medium ones, will take the website down and put it under construction notice up. So on the other extreme, you've got things like Group 5, who've got a whole section of their webpage now to deal with the rescue only, of what notices have gone out, how it's going, what they're doing, etc., etc. So it's also a good communication tool to use the webpage. But you don't have to advise, you don't have to print on your name that, you know, it's XYZ Restaurant Pty Limited brackets in rescue. You don't have to do that.
Yeah, thanks for that. There's another question in relation to SAPOA, and I'll just run through what they've done. And then Henry makes the point that they seemingly presenting an ultimatum, and what's the question is, what can one do apropos the ultimatum? But let's just go through it. So SAPOA have said there will be no evictions for 2 months. There's going to be 35% to 100% remission of rental for April and May. There'll be further relief in rental deferments over 6 to 9 months from 1 July. landlord's discretion, but SAPOA guidelines are minimums. Amounts to discount and deferment depends on whether essential or non-essential, and a highly or medium impacted retailer. That's interest-free for 1 July for 6 to 9 months. And Henry's question is, the landlords are threatening to evict us if we do not sign the addendum where they want us to pay interest on the deferment. The fact of the matter is you are under no obligation to sign an addendum, though an addendum is a way to resolve the conflict. So you'd want to resolve the conflict, and the idea is to find that middle ground, the lesser of the two evils with the landlord. But if you cannot agree, then business rescue will give rise to the situation where as we discussed earlier, the business rescue practitioner suspends the contract and then they cannot evict. Then what happens is the landlord has the right to vote on any plan. And when it comes to a vote by the landlord on the plan, if he approves the vote, it will involve you not being evicted and an arrangement as per the plan. The idea of business rescue is that you put a plan together, you work with the directors, as Peter told us earlier, and that plan gets approved by the creditors. So that would be the idea there. I see we've lost Dean, unfortunately, so he could have given us more insight into SAPOA, but I think I've dealt with that. Let's see if there are any other questions. Please, guys, if I've left anything out, you know what, Ian, just on the business rescue plan and the voting, do you just want to just cover that? Yeah, and you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry about that. The business rescue plan is supposed to be published 25 days after the business rescue practitioner is appointed. That's 25 business days. So that's a very short amount of time. We always strive to adhere to those timeframes because in business rescue, everything is inherently urgent. In cases such as SAA, they've postponed the plan by a couple of months now, which in the circumstances was the correct thing to do because there was a complete paradigm shift as far as the future of the company goes as a result of COVID-19. And before that, they had already extended because it was such a big organization. They had to get their business rescue practitioner has to understand the company, has to understand the reasons for distress properly and everything before he puts a business rescue, before he publishes a business rescue plan. So in the case of SAA, what they've done by extending it has actually been the right thing to do. Smaller businesses, much easier to understand the challenges quickly, much easier to get a plan together on paper and to publish it. So that happens within 25 days. 10 days after the publication of the plan, we hold what is called the Section 152 meeting, or the second meeting of creditors. And that meeting is really to vote on the business rescue plan as to whether the business rescue plan is going to be approved and adopted. And what is required in order for the plan to be approved is a vote by value of everybody who voted. 75% of the creditors by value have to approve the plan. And yes, the creditors are allowed to vote by proxy, or they can be there in person. And of the people who voted, 50% of the vote has to be from independent creditors. In other words, creditors are not linked to directors and shareholders, or not the directors and shareholders themselves. Also, by value can also be done by in person or by proxy. So if you've got the 75% of the independent votes and of all votes and the 50% of the independent vote, then the business rescue plan is approved and adopted, and the business rescue practitioner can immediately then go about rolling out the plan.
Great. There's a point that's made by Amant where he writes, there are funds from banks available given the new liquidity rules, so it's easier against the fixed property for the landlord to take a longer term view and trade out of this crisis. That's precisely why the landlords ought to be reasonable, and that's what COBRA set out to do, is to appeal to the landlord that because of these rules and because of the easing of the credit terms, that should similarly be passed down to the tenant. I don't know if there are any other, I've been through the questions. I think we've answered most of them. Are there any points that the panel would like to make before we conclude?
Yeah, I think
just one thing on the banks. Don't underestimate the trauma that's going on in the banking industry at the moment, because banks are running scared with which of their customers are going to fall over. So whilst capitalization requirements might be relaxed, the banks are still taking a very cautious view, probably more cautious than before, in who they're prepared to lend money to, because they're scratching to make sure that they can survive themselves. I'm talking about the big banks as well, and not necessarily survival, but the big banks have got their own targets, and they are scratching around their budgets to try and find where cash is available.
Thanks. Lisa, can you just give us a snapshot just in the travel industry? You have investigated the airline tickets and the situation there.
Yeah, so I recently gave some insight into an article which was published on Business Insider, essentially dealing with what you do where you've booked flights or you've booked accommodation, and obviously the airlines or the hotel is unable to deliver to you because of the fact that we're in lockdown at the moment. Essentially, the scenario there will be that you are entitled to a refund unless your contract provides that they may reschedule or that you will lose your deposit. So essentially, it will be dependent on what the terms of your contract are. Generally, these contracts of bigger businesses do have BizMail clauses, which deal with the present circumstances, and they'll set out what the rights and obligations of the parties are. But if there isn't a clause like that in the agreement, you will be entitled to a refund, especially in contracts where time is of the essence. In other words, where the flight was required on a specific date or a hotel was required on a specific date.
So just from our audience are the businesses and the hospitality industry. Those deposits then have to be paid back. That's what Lisa's saying. But that'll when you pay those deposits back will be determined by the business rescue process and the business rescue plan. Because remember, those deposits, a claim to those deposits is a claim that is subject to the moratorium.
Yes, and again, so as has been said earlier, generally we're finding that people are quite receptive to negotiating. So often it's not within the business's power to refund all of the deposits that have been paid, specifically businesses which are very tight on cash flow. In those circumstances, generally people have been receptive to moving their booking to a later date. So of course, in the COBRA environment, we will negotiate that type of agreement for you.
Right. There's how do we get hold of COBRA's lobbyist? Write to me directly or to info@COBRA, but it's probably best to write to me, crespi@schindlers.co.za. Her name is Chantal Gladwin. She's my partner. You can also email her directly, but I think best you go through me, and we'll get the info relevant to you. And I think we're also going to be putting together some petitions by restaurant owners, particularly in relation to the delivery side, just to ramp up the strength of our representations. I see there's a question here in relation to insurance, where the business interruption section currently includes the infectious disease extension. Then with effect from 1 May 2020, the business interruption section of the policy is amended by deleting the infectious disease. So that's quite interesting. So it appears what the insurance companies are doing now, and when it comes to the renewals, they are changing the policies to not cover the corona situation, but now corona or COVID is the cause. So the question then is, if you're covered under the policy when it began hitting and when it started hitting your business, and they amend the policy, what then? Are you covered for business interruption post? It depends on the policy wording, but I'd be surprised if you were not covered. If you're covered by the policy, you remain covered by the policy post. But again, it's depends on the policy wording. And what I'll do is I will specifically raise this tomorrow's insurance webinar, and let's have a discussion. So what we'll do is we'll research this particular question and we'll deal with it tomorrow.
Maurice, what I suggest too is any restaurateurs, just check your policy and speak to your broker about converting portion clauses in your policy. So for example, if you've got a bucky that you're using in the restaurant that's now stuck in the basement of the shopping center, convert it into, take away all risks and put it fire and theft, etc. So amend it to reduce your premium. So get your premium down, but make sure you don't cancel anything, because as soon as you cancel anything, I think the point that has just been made here, you're going to certainly have to read the small print very carefully on when your policy is put back in place. But do keep your insurance going, quite essential. But do look at where you're spending money, because there might be some reduction that you can put into place. Contents, other than fire and theft in a shopping center, you don't necessarily need to insure it all. So just speak to your broker on that about reducing the cover for this period.
Yeah, and I think also with respect to the labor component, I think Pierre will be better versed here than me, but with respect to one minimum wage payment and requirements from a legal point of view, firms, even before COVID, had an opportunity to apply for exemptions, and the exemption would be over a 12-year period where you could motivate to pay your employees a cost or a fee or a remuneration below minimum wage insofar as you could justify it, and there'll be certain, boundaries within which that would be acceptable. The second one is around also for businesses to be friends of the CCMA. And so often CCMA has tended to take a remedial process only when people have gone there to complain, but they're actually sitting on a lot of information and a lot of enterprise support mechanisms that actually can enable businesses to transition and work better with the employees, for example, with wage negotiations, etc. Before it is an issue that has blown up. I think there certainly is an opportunity for businesses to engage proactively with the CCMA, and they've got good capacity there.
Great, thanks for that.
Yeah, I think just obviously from an employment law perspective, I think it's important to note that there's many ways to look at it and many ways to approach it. There is obviously the annual leave option, there's the unpaid leave option, there's also government support. Government support in the form of COVID-19 TERS, which is available, which is basically a UIF-based benefit to employees, but it's applied by the employer. So that obviously that could take a lot of strain off of a business if a business applies for its employees, especially during this lockdown period. There is that form of government support. We have published an article on it. In fact, the article actually needs to be revised because I think it was last week, the 9th of April, that a revised directive on COVID-19 TERS was published. So we're still busy working through it, and we will update our article online on that. So you can have a look at that, and we'll probably be doing a webinar on the new directives and the application process for employers to look at utilizing COVID-19 TERS. But as I said, an employer needs to carefully look at the different options available, unpaid leave, annual leave, for instance, and how that can be used to the best advantage of the business.
Great, thanks, Pierre. Just to conclude, I just want to mention what COBRA can do for you guys. If you enter the COBRA ecosystem now, it's a pro bono initiative. If you were to enter now, and let's say the business rescue were to not work, and the business rescue has to be converted into a liquidation, that process generally costs between 20 and 50,000 rands. It's a high court application. That's going to be covered as a pro bono service. If you're going to be losing your company and you're going to be losing your business, obviously the last thing you want to do is to pay that kind of money. There's we can set up consultations with your team, your staff. We can explain everything to them. It's all pro bono. The engagement with the business rescue practitioners, the submission of the forms that you do go into business rescue is pro bono. The actual business rescue process, there's a means test in relation to whether it's pro bono or not. It's quite a simple one. If any professional fees, we've got a panel of professionals, if professional fees are going to come between a successful business rescue and a liquidation, there will be no fees. So the idea is that fees will never, ever, ever be an impediment. In other words, if it gets to the liquidation stage, the process will not have cost a cent. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks to the panelists. Remember, there are further webinars. Have a look at the COBRA website for specific webinars. Otherwise, we have webinars every day at 10 o'clock. It's the same link. And just a reminder that we also have the insurance webinar tomorrow, and there are further webinars that Peter made mention of. Thank you very much. Thanks, panelists. Cheers.